All right, well, welcome to probably the least sexy talk of this entire conference, remote check deposit or remote deposit capture. You'll hear both terms. The remote deposit capture is kind of the more industry term, I guess. Remote check deposit's probably a little bit more understandable if you're not dealing with this quite a bit. Just to let you guys know, you can pretty much completely ignore the slides. They're mostly there to keep me from going completely off topic and talking about something wholly unrelated. They don't actually have much information on them. So yeah, don't have to worry about that. So me, I'm Luke Van Oort. I am one of the senior software engineers on the Wave Money team at Wave. So Wave is sort of a just general small business financial services company. So we do accounting and payroll and lots of those sorts of just things that small businesses kind of struggle with because they don't have enough people to hire an accountant or have a department to handle them. And dealing with them, is just kind of a struggle for one person who probably doesn't have an accounting background. And the Wave Money team provides sort of the banking services side of that. So we provide a business debit card, check deposit, as you might be able to guess, ACH, that kind of thing. So prior to Wave, I was working on just various different things all over other industries, areas of the tech stack. So I've been around the block a bit. When I joined Wave, we were just starting our check deposit implementation. So we had gone through and done sort of our vendor selection and that kind of thing. And we were getting down to the point where the rubber met the road. So I ended up writing a lot of the code that handles the actual mechanics of taking the check and getting it into somebody's bank account, which is what we'll be talking about today. So when you leave the talk, you'll know sort of how checks are deposited. You'll be aware of some of those quirks. So this is a very legacy process. There's a lot of oddities. There's a lot of manual processes. There's a lot of things that you may not expect. There are certainly a lot of things that we didn't expect. And yeah, so this should arm you with some knowledge about what questions you need to ask and what sort of things you need to look out for if you're going down this route yourself. Of course, this is sort of implicit in this, that this is targeted at neobanks. If you're a Wells Fargo, you don't need this presentation. But yeah, if you've gone through this with your neobank, you'll probably have a little bit of some catharsis. It's not just you that had some difficulties with this process. So who even uses checks, right? This is sort of the elephant in the room. Whenever the concept of check deposit comes up, people are like, well, I don't use checks. Nobody uses checks. Why are you even wasting your time doing this? Which is actually a fair question, right? So one of the groups that still uses checks is small businesses. So obviously for Wave, that's a very important segment. A lot of people want to pay their various different gardeners and stuff with checks. Plumbers might want to take checks, right? This is a pretty common way to transfer sums of money that would be impractical to use cash for, and they don't want to go and get a bank draft or something, obviously. These days, this is getting phased out. So we're Canada-based. In Canada, Interac e-transfer would be the way that these sort of transactions are starting to be done more and more. Here, I guess you'd be using Venmo or something like that. They don't exist in Canada, so we don't use them. But it still does happen, right? It's not at a zero transaction volume yet. And another group would be, of course, governments, right? So lots of people got their economic action payments in the form of checks. Your tax rebate might be a check. This is still something that's being phased out, right? I don't know how fast it's going in the States. In Canada, a lot of people receive their tax refunds via a direct deposit into their bank account. But again, it still does happen. And that's sort of one of the pertinent points here is sometimes this isn't really so much a choice that you're making because you think it's going to make you money or because this is something that is going to be a high volume or a high value added part of your offering. It's to check a box, right? So a lot of people get really upset when they can't deposit a check. And if you can't deposit a check that you have in your hand and that is your primary banking service, you're kind of you're really not going to be happy. And for us, that was part of why we did it. Especially because our segment is one of the segments that still uses checks quite a bit. The third group is, of course, a group that you probably don't want to be servicing, but the reality is we're all servicing that group at some point. We just hope we figure out who they are before they get any money out of us or money out of our customers. And that is a pretty significant segment of the market for check deposit, unfortunately. This is an area that is very rife with fraud. And as you'll see a little bit later on in the presentation, or as you can probably already intuit, checks are not the most advanced modern technology. They don't have an enormous amount of anti-fraud built in. At the end of the day, it's pretty easy to make a fake check and then try to deposit it. You just have to figure out that that's actually a fake check. So I'm going to go back to a little bit more legacy than you probably thought I was ever going to talk about in this. So checks, I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to go too much into the boring details of this. But checks have, of course, been around for a very, very long time. And where checks began is, I don't know, who knows, right? It's probably a semantical question. But when you start to see the very early forms of what we recognize today as check deposit, you will start to see the sort of very linear development as we get more and more modern. We get more and more optimizations off of the same basic kernel of functionality. So going back to these 1700s and 1800s technologies, it's actually surprisingly informative for understanding how it works in 2022, which might make you feel like crying, but it's the way it is. So back in the late 1700s, this was a very British technology. They met at a pub. So your check was something that you gave to your banker, and your banker literally went to the pub with all of the other bankers, and there was some dude who sat at the head of the room and called up people from different banks. It was like, okay, now you're going to deal with your checks, and then the other, the people from the other institutions come up, and they would figure out who owed who, how much, and they would transfer the funds. Presumably, everybody who wasn't currently dealing with checks, wasn't the person in the hot seat, was probably drinking quite a lot of bitter. So they probably were very happy with this process. A little bit later on, we get the Americans into it. And of course, they took some of the fun out of the process. They got rid of the bitter. But they also made a very important technological advancement. They switched from making this whole pub system, right, to using a round or actually oval-shaped table. This sounds like stupid, right? Like, why would the shape of the table matter? But the innovation here was that they could have representatives from each bank would sit across from each other. They would exchange their checks, exchange their funds, figure out who owed who, how much, presumably do some due diligence on the checks, right, and make sure that it wasn't complete nonsense. And then every so often, somebody would ring a bell and they would move one seat over. So basically they'd play musical chairs. So not really a technological solution, but personally as an engineer, I think this is brilliant because this vastly improved the performance of the system, right? So you're now processing all of these check deposits in parallel instead of doing them sequentially. And that gets you way more improvement or way more performance, right? You can handle much higher volumes of checks. You can handle just scaling much better. But there's some problems with this process, right? So it's still a physical manual process. People have to all come to the same place and meet at this table. So where are your pain points from scaling, right? You go to too many different institutions, you can only make a table so big. You go to institutions with far-flung customers, you're still dealing with physical checks. How do you get them to the place where the table is? You have to mail them or something. This is slow. What if they get lost in the mail? At the end of the day, it's not a particularly performant process, even though it was a significant improvement. So how do we go and improve this? How do we get it so that we're not dealing with that sort of long-range challenge of getting checks from point A to point B? How do we deal with more institutions, especially when you consider that as you're dealing with more institutions, more and more often you're going to be sitting across from somebody who you have no checks for, right? So this would actually work pretty well in Canada because we have like half a dozen major banks. Here in the States, we have several thousand registered banks. You can't deal with this, and like a small local bank in Texas probably is not going to be dealing with checks that are coming from a small local bank in Maine, right? So they would be wasting their time at this table sort of situation. And of course, as your volume scales up, if you deal with sort of the Canadian model, where you have a small number of very large banks, you can only exchange so many checks so fast across the table. So how do we scale this? So, unsurprisingly, you digitize the checks. So you don't actually need a check, right? You think about what do you need off of a check to transfer money? You need to know who you're sending it to and who it's coming from, but you don't really need to know those. Those are primarily for compliance requirements, right? You need to make sure that you're not sending funds to a terrorist organization or something like that. What you really need to know is the routing number and account number that you're sending the funds from, the routing number and the account number that you're sending the funds to, and you need to know the amount. Right? And everything else is basically for risk and fraud checks and all of that kind of stuff. So this is embarrassingly digitizable data, right? So the data that you actually are actioning the transfer with is just a handful of numbers at the end of the day, and that's it, right? So you can imagine even in a pre-internet time, you could transfer this very easily. You probably still want a check image, of course. This is going to be very important for dealing with disputes. Right, like it's important for disputes. Somebody says, I didn't write this check. You want to show them the check, be like, that's your signature. And they say, okay. The bankers are another source of the problems, right? So that whole process of the physical bankers, it's slow. You can only handle so many things in parallel. You can only handle so many checks sequentially. It's not great. But this is another spot where you can see that it would be improved very significantly by digitizing them. So it's pretty easy to have a computer go through a document that has all of these accounting and routing numbers, match them up, summate them, figure out at the end of the day, okay, this institution needs to send this institution, $3 million, this institution owes this institution $2 million, this institution owes this institution $0, right? It's pretty easy for a computer to do that, even if it's hard for a person to do that. So this is basically where we're at today. So we've done both of these things. We digitized the checks into a file format that's called X937. There's a standard for this. You have to pay like $100 to go get the standard. It's long. It's a very old file format. It has its quirks. It's annoying to parse. Luckily, a small company called Moov, who I believe probably everybody here has heard of, has a very handy Go library that will parse these and can generate them, assuming you have the data. But good library. I recommend checking it out if you are thinking about going down this path and you are working in Go. So you make these X937s. They all get sent to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve handles all of this business with figuring out who owes who what and doing all of that. I'm going to hand wave through the fund transfer bit, but handling all of that kind of stuff. Because from our perspective, they're a bit of a black box. So at this point, a lot of people started thinking, like, wait a minute. So I am only using the digital representation of the check. And at one point in time, you kind of needed to do this at the institution, right? Because you didn't have good ways to do OCR, so optical character recognition. You couldn't read these numbers off of a check easily. What they used was a magnetic ink reader, so it's effectively like a barcode scanner for a very specialized font, which is those funny looking numbers on the bottom of a check. You don't really expect your customers to be carrying those around. But as we advance through various different iterations of technology, we now get to today where everybody is carrying a high resolution, high quality camera in their pocket. And we have powerful computers that can just look at a picture of a check and can pull off, easily pull off the account and routing numbers. Might struggle a bit with some people's handwritings for the amounts, which is a more important point than it sounds like. But at the end of the day, why are you making them to go to the branch at all, right? All you need is an image of the check. That's all you care about. And then you can extract all the other data. So this is sort of the genesis of remote deposit capture, right? Now, this is how it actually starts working, right? So a check is printed. This is going to seem very obvious, I'm sure, to everybody here. But this is where some of the assumptions come into this process and some of the quirks that have caused us problems. So a check is printed. This is the first one which caused us problems. There is basically nothing that prevents somebody from just printing checks. Right? You can go and there are services out there that will just print checks for you. And will they work? I don't know. I've never used them. But they will just print checks for you. Not everybody follows the standards correctly for what they should print on a check and how they should do it. The standard itself is actually quite confusing. I'm originally a mechanical engineer, so I can read a drawing, but these check standards of what should be laid out where made my head spin. So it is a very convoluted standard, but there is a standard and not everybody follows it. So how you deal with that is kind of up to you. The way that we handle it is if it doesn't follow the standard and we can't figure out the information from it, tough luck, basically. It's not following the standard. Who knows, what's up with that check. So then, of course, somebody fills out the info. This is sort of one of those obvious sources of problems, right? People have bad handwriting, whatever. We all know that. Your customer gets it, and then your customer tries to take photos. So that last step I have an asterisk on because you technically don't control the environment that your customer is taking photos in, and you don't control what they're taking photos with. But you do control the application they're using to take the photos. So you kind of have control here, you kind of don't. And you do need to be a little bit careful about making sure that your customer is not taking photos in a really dark room of a dark check or a bright check on a bright background so you can't figure out where the boundaries of the check are, or a lot of these sorts of things. Your app can enforce some of that. You have to deal with customer frustration though, right? The more you enforce, you have to have your check in this little box lit just right with the right amount of contrast, the more upset they're going to be when they can't get it into that little box with just the right amount of contrast. Something else that's sort of a nuance here is that this is a relatively young space with a lot of patents. So how you're going to go about capturing these checks, you need to be a little bit careful. If you're going to try to roll this yourself, you might run across patents that are held by other companies. And that you don't want to be infringing on patents that you're unaware of that you're infringing upon. So after that, we go through and we start processing these checks, right? So we're extracting the information from them. That is another step that is kind of challenging. The OCR side of this is not the easiest thing in the world to roll yourself. As I said earlier, you can get the account and routing numbers pretty easily. Getting amounts is very difficult. Figuring out the address information, for instance, can be surprisingly difficult. Usually that's printed with a printer that's not handwritten, but where it is on the check varies. And different companies will start putting designs on the back of your check that can confuse your OCR and just cause all kinds of issues. So while you might have some young engineer who's yes, I'm going to write my own OCR system. It's going to be so good and it's going to solve all of these problems. We don't need to pay anybody to do this. I would be careful about taking that approach because there's a lot of variation in the actual checks that can confuse OCR systems. So then this is a batch process. This is classic traditional finance. Everybody loves their batch processes. So you're going to batch together all of your checks. You generate one of these X937 files. So the file itself has a lot of data in it. A lot of the data is optional, and so that's part of why the spec is so big. A few of the pieces of data are very important. A few of them are primarily important for disputes. A few of them I'm not entirely sure what they even do. But there's a lot of data in this file. Generating them from scratch, from an image, is again not trivial. But it can be done. You just need a copy of that spec, and you probably need to figure out where you're going to get all that data from. Once you have one of these files with all your checks, it gets submitted to the Fed, and then from that point, it's kind of out of your hands, and they're dealing with figuring out who owes who how much from all of the files that have been submitted that day and transferring the funds around accordingly. So what does this look like for us? So we do a little bit of process ourselves, but primarily we outsource this to a company called MyTech. Then from that point, it goes through our internal risk and compliance review. So that's all of your checking to make sure that this seems reasonable. This isn't a check that's way out of the realm of what this person would normally do. Making sure that it's not being used for purchasing explosives or going to a terrorist organization or what have you, right? All of the stuff that we're legally required to do, and if we didn't, we would probably have a very interesting day at work and then get dropped by all of our partners. So once we go through internal review, it gets submitted back to MyTech. So I have a MyTech / Incinta here. So Incinta's, if I remember correctly, a subsidiary of Jack Henry. They deal with just a lot of check file processing and that kind of thing. Like they have a pretty broad portfolio of products, but that's how we are integrated with them. But we don't directly handle that integration. That's sort of a supported partner integration of MyTech. So this decision came before I joined Wave, but basically it was like we could either use MyTech, I could do some image processing and then send it back to us, and then we would have to build out that entire X9 ourselves, or we could just use Incinta. We went with just using Incinta. From that point, there's some verification that's done on their end. So MyTech handles a lot of the, like, does this check look legit? Like, does this look like a real check? Incinta's handling a lot of sort of across their entire network, making sure that the check is, you know, not a duplicate presentment within their network before we're sending it off to the Fed, or a duplicate presentment within our own program, or, you know, various other things like that. If it's flagged, we review it in their portal, and if it passes, either one of these cases just goes straight to the X9 that's generated for that day. That box that's X9 being sent to CFSB. CFSB is our banking partner. That box should probably have a little bit more detail on it. So one of the nuances here is that there's a lot of different identifiers throughout this whole process. Not everybody talks in the same identifiers, and some of them are very sensitive. So you're not going to be sending account and routing numbers all over the place if you can avoid it. That would be probably illegal in a lot of circumstances. So you need to have, you know, other identifiers, right, that you can use, and not everybody speaks the same ones. So as part of this transfer process, we're doing some processing of that X9 to make sure that everybody knows what check they're talking about in the file, which is actually primarily for compliance reasons. But anyway, then that's sent off to the Fed. They handle all the funds. So this is just our happy path. You notice I don't have anything in here that's like how we handle check rejections, because that is a kind of messy process, which is over here. So these are more stages that you don't control. So this is a bad diagram. This is an intentionally bad diagram because this is actually what it's kind of like in reality. And I'm sure in another year or two, we'll probably have another handful of diamonds that we could throw on here. This is a process that is very manual at times and a lot less sort of streamlined, modern fintech than you would think. Or it might be exactly as, you know, not modern as you think, given that it's check deposit. So that top line was the primary method that we initially thought we would be handling rejections via. So the Fed looking at the check and saying, this is a duplicate presentment, or, I mean, I guess to a little bit degree, that second one where the bank where the check is drawing from says, hey, look, duplicate presentment. And us receiving an X9 return, this is actually basically the same file format as the forward X9. You can technically put both in the same file if you wanted to, but same data at the end of the day. The exception of the return includes why it was returned. And then we would just process that, deal with any sort of fund transfer issues, and inform our customers. You know, carefully inform your customers, because when you're dealing with rejections, you don't want to provide insight into like a fraud process, right? So you have to be a little bit mindful of what you actually tell them and what you tell them to contact support about. And yeah, so that was the process that we thought we were going to be dealing with. The process that we discovered that we were also going to be dealing with is this whole manual procedure. So every now and then we'll get an email from CFSB that says, hey, this check was rejected. Sometimes that's all they tell us. Sometimes there's a photo of the check. Sometimes there's a reason code for the check. Sometimes there's very little information. And oftentimes just a little bit of a back and forth because we have to figure out what check they're even talking about. And this was unanticipated on our part. We had to deal with a lot of this kind of stuff. Like, we discovered this the first time we got one of these emails, and we were like, oh, so now we have to cancel this check via a manual process. It can't go through our nice tested pipeline. And that's something that if you're going down this route, you're going to have to deal with, right? This is a manual legacy process. It has manual legacy spots in it. And so you need to have a procedure for dealing with, inserting yourself into the flow, right? And redirecting where the check's going, if it's going into the rejection pile or not, or however you choose to implement that. That bottom one was one that was really surprising to us. So this has happened, to my knowledge, once for us. So we had a case of a duplicate presentment, which was not malicious at all. Something you also need to keep in mind. Not all duplicate presentments are malicious. Not all fraudulent checks are actually attempts at fraud. This was a case where somebody deposited a check with us, and then their partner, unaware that the check had already been deposited it with a different institution. So that actually happens, not too infrequently. What made this one particularly interesting was it was deposited with us first, but we had to return the funds, because duplicate presentments are not so simple as who got the check deposited first. There's a whole bunch of legalese that I'm not qualified to talk about regarding sort of the order of what gives you the, what makes you sort of the depositor who's gets the funds, basically, at the end of the day, right? What makes you the one who's, the duplicate presentment one, and who's the one who has the actual canonical deposit. In our case, if I remember correctly, this had to do with it being a remote deposit and the person hadn't endorsed the check, and then the other one was physically at a branch, so they counted and we didn't. But we had a lot of what in the world is going on when that request came through. So yeah, so this is just a very messy, very manual procedure. So just to hit some takeaways. That top one, actually, let me go back. I forgot to talk about that. So you may notice from these two, these processes here, and then this one, that there's no confirmation that a check was successfully deposited, or that it successfully failed, right? So the funds do transfer. You know that the funds transferred. This is a kind of optimistic process, right? So funds transfer, and then you can receive a rejection. So the exact time period is 30 days, if I remember correctly. You usually receive your funds the next day. So you have to deal with the reality of sometimes you'll have made funds available to your customer, and then you'll have to claw them back. And that's an awkward time, especially if they've already spent those funds. So most rejections happen pretty quick, so it's a few days. I don't know what our record is. Don't remember offhand. I think it's probably like a week or something like that. Usually it's within a day or two. The way you combat the sort of the hazard of you having made the funds available and then them spending it and then you needing to return the funds is, of course, long hold times, right? So the longer your hold time is, the less likely you are to have to return funds that were already spent. But of course, a 30-day hold time, if you tried to shove that on your customers, nobody is going to be banking with you. And ours, which I believe are 5 to 8 days at the moment, huge source of customer complaints. I think it's actually the #1 source of customer complaints for us. Your large Wells Fargo institutions, of course, they can do this very quickly. They have the legal teams to go after people who, to claw back those funds. They probably are dealing with such a high volume of checks that they could easily, a lot of their checks are coming from Wells Fargo to Wells Fargo. So they can do some very detailed analysis and make sure that those checks aren't about to get returned. But if you're a small neobank, you don't have that large team of lawyers. You don't have that huge volume to lean onto. So you might have to run long hold times. And unfortunately, customers don't like that. So the process can be surprisingly manual. This is heavily on the return side of things. As we all know, the happy path is always easy to implement, the clean, the nice, the thing that you write presentations about. The sad path of what do we do with things that go wrong, usually much messier, and this is no exception. And you'll have to be prepared to do a lot of manual intervention to deal with that. And of course, the legacy systems are frustrating. So a lot of these are sort of technical nuances that I didn't really cover, but there's a lot of spots where we ran into issues where there were invalidly formatted X9s that we had to figure out. There's a few lines of code from us in Moov's X9 package to deal with those, and I imagine probably everybody else who's actually using it in production probably is also contributing back or has forked it or something, because there is a decent number of quirks and unusual things that you'll run across. So yeah, that's it. So I guess we have technically we have 1 minute for questions, so who can talk fast?
When you started, how accurately do you think you understood the process? How much discovery happened while you were building?
So the question was, when we started, how accurately did we think we understood the process, and how much discovery went through as we actually did it? That's a tough one. So like a lot of the challenges that we faced actually in our initial deploying it and getting the whole thing running in production were actually legal. So in our case, as you saw from the how Wave does it flowchart, there's a few different players involved in this. There's obviously us, there's MyTech, there's Incenta, and there's CFSB. And that's signing a 4-way contract that has a lot of sort of like, well, if this goes wrong, you're responsible for it. And if this goes wrong, I'm responsible for it. Well, I don't want to be responsible for that. And that took, I think, months to actually nail down. So we technically had our check deposit dev complete, I think 2 months before we deposited our first check, because the legal stuff was still ongoing. And these were companies that we had been engaged with for, I think, like 6 months or something at that point. So that can be challenging, which might make you want to not go for third-party people, but I want to just point back to there's a lot of nuances to this and a lot of sort of legacy complexities. That challenge may partially be because we are sort of doing it ourselves and sort of outsourcing it. If you're going through this route to just check a box, take a strong consideration to going with a company that does this whole thing for you, so you don't have to deal with that discovery process. For the rest of the process, I don't know, I think we understood the happy path pretty well. How we dealt with failing checks and the whole host of reasons why people can have bogus checks or have problems with the checks. That I don't think we understood as well, but I think that's the reality of engineering. You'll never understand the failure modes as well as you understand the success modes. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you.